Scripture reading this morning will be taken from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 12. Hebrews 11, 8 through 12. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, also there was born of one man, as him was good as dead at that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the same seashore.
Good morning. We're going to continue with our theme this morning of kind of some foundational principles, if you will. We talked this morning during the Bible class hour in thinking about godliness in the home, the idea of holiness or godliness, certainly on an individual level, as well as that in the home. And so for a few minutes now, I want us to kind of stick with that same idea, kind of on that foundational level of things, and talk for a few minutes about the importance of faith at the foundational level, individually for sure, but also the importance of it at the foundational roots of our families in the home. That faith is the foundation of the marriage relationship. That faith is the foundation of the parent-child relationship. That faith is something that moves and directs everything in our lives, that moves and directs everything in our homes. Now, we know that faith is a foundational principle. We have passages like 2 Peter chapter 1 at the very outset of Peter's letter. He writes, remember all of these things to add. When we grow and as we mature, we are adding to our faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control. We're adding to our faith those things. That faith is the foundation on which everything sits on. We have passages like Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6 specifically that begins by saying in a very simple way, without faith, it's impossible to please God. Now, you can't confuse that passage. There's no skirting around a verse like that. There's no coming at it from different angles. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. So that tells me that faith needs to be a foundational principle in my life. That as a husband, faith needs to be a foundational principle that rules that relationship. As a father, as a leader in the home, faith needs to be a foundational principle that leads in the home. So this morning we're going to talk about faith. And we're going to do so by talking about the faith of Abraham and Sarah. Now you may be thinking that it may be odd to use Abraham and Sarah as a great example of faith because really throughout their life, as you study through the book of Genesis, they didn't often make faithful choices. For instance, Abraham lies to save his own skin, not once but twice, Scripture tells us about. Sarah decides to take things kind of in her own hands, giving Hagar, her maidservant, to Abraham, and he goes along with it. In Genesis chapter 18, Sarah, and the way that she reacts to the news that she is going to be the one to bear Abraham a child is interesting. I know you may have your finger there in Hebrews chapter 11. You can hold it. We're going to come back to that. But turn over to Genesis chapter 18. We're going to read a passage from there. We're going to come back to it at the very end of our study. But Genesis chapter 18, when it's reiterated that this is going to be Sarah, she'll be the one to bear you a son. And it's interesting the way that they react to the news of this. In Genesis chapter 18, beginning of verse 9, it says that they said to him, well, where is Sarah, your wife? And so he said, here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. And now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being this old also? That doesn't sound like faithful choices being made. But yet in places in the New Testament, like 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, Peter will use Sarah as the model that all Christian women are to follow. And in Hebrews chapter 11, the passage that was read for us just a moment ago, it is Abraham and Sarah that are both mentioned by name, a couple that I find most interesting. If you're familiar with the chapter of Hebrews 11, it is a bullet point fashion about faith, and men and women who exhibited incredible feats of faith, and they showcase their faith in various ways. And you have these men and women that by faith they portrayed this, they had this attitude, they did this thing, and it goes through these incredible examples of faith. I find it interesting that it is Abraham and Sarah, a married couple, husband and wife, that are mentioned back to back. Moses' parents are mentioned, but not by name, a little bit later on in the passage. But it is Abraham and Sarah that God points to when talking about faith. So we think about them. Did they make mistakes in their lives? Most certainly they did. We've read and mentioned several of them already. But we find them learning from those mistakes and holding tightly to God through all of it. And as a couple, they learned and they grew in their faith. And it is a beautiful picture about how faith can work inside the home. You have this husband and wife growing and learning together. And so when Hebrews chapter 11 is to be penned, God chooses the two of them to lift up to us, to exemplify when it comes to their faith. So let's dig in a little bit to what he says specifically. We're going to start with Abraham. We had read for us already this beginning idea of Abraham. We have Abraham specifically mentioned in 8 through 10. He comes back to him in 17 through 19. Let's read those passages together again, and we're going to point out a few things along the way that we can learn about the faith of Abraham that we can apply to our lives also today. I'm in Hebrews chapter 11, beginning of verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise, for he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now, jump down to verse 17 of that same chapter. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. And now I want us to think about this passage and what we can learn about faith. We've already made the point. Faith is a foundational principle in our life, in our roles as Christians, in our following of Christ, discipling of his. It is a foundational principle, and it's something that we have to cultivate. It's something that we have to work on. It's something that we have to grow in. What a great opportunity we have to do that this morning. By looking at Abraham, by looking at Sarah, and how they showcase their faith, and what faith looks like. That's the question I want you to think about. What does faith look like? Well, this passage helps. Because when we think about Abraham, specifically in verse 8, we see that by faith Abraham obeyed. Did you see that, verse 8? By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called out to leave his home, although he had no idea where he was going. You know what that reminds me of? Verse 1 of this chapter. We often use Hebrews 11 verse 1 as a kind of a definition about what faith is, and I like that and don't like that all at the same time, because it gives us a good idea about what faith is, but the entirety of this chapter really is a definition about what faith is. But Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Do you see that in this passage in verse 8 with Abraham? He was called out by God to go to a place that he had not seen, to go to a place that he did not know, to go to a place that he had not been, to go to some place that he was not familiar with. And he obeys, even though he didn't know where he was going or what that place was going to be. You see, in every way, that is conviction. Conviction in things not seen. Our culture today doesn't like the word obedience. Just doesn't. I think even religious culture today is liking the idea of obedience less and less and less. Certainly our United States American culture doesn't like the idea of obedience. But when it comes to our faith, obedience is something that is within it, all within it. It's a key component to it. You could turn back in your Bibles just a couple of pages to Hebrews chapter 5, just a couple of pages back. Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 9, where the writer will tell us that having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation. That sounds great. The author of eternal salvation. I'm interested in that. To all those who obey him. You see, it's a key component of what our relationship is with God. It's why Jesus can say, and John can reiterate in his writings, that if we love Jesus, then we'll keep his commandments. Those two things go hand in hand. It's a point that John will make even in his writing in 1 John when he says that you can say as loud as you want to say, I love God, but yet if you hate your brother, a commandment that God has asked us to obey, you're a liar, and the love of God is not in you. And so we have these things that go hand in hand. Our relationship with God and our obedience to him. Don't think about those things as two separate things that occur or that have to occur. They are things that go together. That's what faith is. It is trusting in that relationship. It is leaning upon God in all ways. And what that is all about, what we see here from Abraham, is obedience. We've talked already about easy to understand passages that are impossible to misrepresent, such as without faith it is impossible to please him. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 46, from the mouth of Jesus, he asks a question, a very simple question: why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things that I say? It's as if Jesus is confused by that when he asks this question. He's confused by how this could be. How is it even possible? How is it even possible that you call me Lord, Lord? How is it even possible that you cry that you love me from the mountaintops? How is it even possible that you call my name, but yet you don't listen or you don't do the things that I say? It's Jesus being confused by that, asking that question, explain that to me. Because with Jesus, it's something that doesn't work. It doesn't compute. Those two things do not go together. If you're going to call me Lord, Lord, you will do the things that I say. And so when we think about faith and we think about growing in our faith, we have to be willing to listen to God. We have to be willing to listen to God and trust what he says. Secondly, by faith. In verses 9 and 10, as we just read a moment ago, by faith, Abraham sojourned. He sojourned as in a foreign country. Again, hold your fingers here in Hebrews 11. We'll come back to that. Go again back to the book of Genesis, to the story of Abraham and Sarah. We were in Genesis 18 just a moment ago. We're going to go backwards a little bit to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15. I want you to look as we read a couple of passages and think about how it is it's talked about the place that Abraham was to be in. You see, by faith, he sojourns to this place as in a foreign country. He was living there as in a foreign country. Although he was in the promised land that God promised to him in Genesis chapter 12 to his descendants, it wouldn't be their land for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. He was there as in a foreign country. Look at what's said specifically about it. I'm in Genesis now, Genesis chapter 13. Genesis chapter 13, beginning in verse 14 of that text. He says, and the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. And then Abraham moved his tent, and he went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which were in Hebron, and he built an altar there to the Lord. Now turn a page in your Bible to Genesis chapter 15, beginning of verse 13 now. He said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge afterward. They come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age, but in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And it came to pass when the sun went down and it was dark that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between these pieces. And on the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And so the idea here is that this land that Abraham goes to, that God is promising to his descendants, Abraham is in that land as a pilgrim. He is in that land as a sojourner. He is in that place as a foreigner. It wouldn't be their land for a long, long, long time. That's exactly where we are. It's exactly where we are. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, Peter will make the point that we as Christians are sojourners and pilgrims here in this world, in this land. We have been promised land. We have been promised something greater, but we are here as a sojourner, as a pilgrim, as a foreigner, as in a foreign country. Now, what difference does that make? Well, the difference that it makes is it helps, that realization helps in our living godly or living holy. If I know that, listen, I'm here for a temporary time, or I'm not from around here, or this is not a place for me. It's where I am now, but it's not a place for me. It makes it easier to be godly and holy. We see this all the time. We've had great opportunities to do some traveling. Maybe you've traveled as well, but think about leaving this country. We've been out of this country several times. We've been on vacation in other places, in Europe a couple of times, and you spend some time over there, and you've got a camera, and you are a tourist, and you look like a tourist, and everybody there knows that you're a tourist, and they know you're an American, and they know you don't speak their language, that you only speak English, and Americans don't speak any other language, and so we expect everybody else to speak English, and you're dealing with all of that, and you look different, and you act different, and people know you are not from there. But you know what? When we're in that scenario, we're not bothered by that because we understand the reality of that situation. I'm not from here. That's exactly right. I am a tourist. I don't speak your language. I am here just for a temporary time, and then I'm leaving. We understand that reality, and because I understand that reality, it doesn't make any difference if when I sit at a table at a restaurant and they say, "You're an American, right?" And I'm like, "Yes, I am." Right? That doesn't bother me. That reality that as a Christian, I am not from here. I don't live here. I am a foreigner. I am a pilgrim. I am a sojourner. If I can grasp that reality, it will make living godly and holy easier because I won't be bothered by that. You're looking at me different as if I'm not from around here. That's okay because I'm not from around here. You're looking at me different. You're looking at me different because I don't act or talk like everybody else acts and talk. I'm okay with that. I'm not from around here. You see, faith allows us to have an understanding of that reality. And thirdly, here with Abraham, as we jump down to verses 17 through 19, we see the idea that by faith, Abraham offered up Isaac. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this particular story. We're going to spend all of our time this afternoon here in Genesis chapter 22 about this story specifically. But the understanding was that by faith, Abraham was willing to offer, here's the key, that which was closest to him. The most valuable thing to him. He was willing to offer that. Now, he was willing to do that solely based upon the promises that God made to him. And so that has to be where our faith gets us to. A fill-in-the-blank scenario. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is our faith must get us to the point that we would be willing to offer God our anything. It's exactly what he asks. Look at the book of Luke, Luke chapter 14. A hard to grab hold of passage in Luke chapter 14. Not hard words to read or hard words to understand, but a concept that is heavy. But in every way, it's what faith is. Being willing to offer to God my anything. That's what Jesus asks for. Look at what he says. Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse 26. Luke 14, beginning in verse 26. He says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Lest after he has laid the foundation, is not able to finish, all who sees it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king goes to make war against another king, does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple." Now, those are not hard words to read. But that is a heavy thing that Jesus is asking. Let's think for a second what he says. He says, if you want to be my disciple, two things. Number one, you better be serious about that. And you better consider that. You better be serious about that. And you better consider it. Because this relationship is not something to be taken lightly. You've got to count the cost. And the reason we've got to count the cost, what's the cost that Jesus says? My everything. That's heavy. That's where Abraham was. Abraham's most valuable thing around him was Isaac. And God says, give him to me. And by faith, Abraham offers him up. What a powerful lesson it is to each and every one of us. So how are we able to do those kinds of things? He gives us Sarah. How are we able to do these kinds of things? Let's close with this idea. In Hebrews chapter 11, specifically in talking now about the faith of Sarah, I want you to listen to specifically what is said about her. It says, by faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed. And she bore a child when she was past the age because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man and him as good as dead were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. How are we able to do these kinds of things? How are we able to obey? How are we able to live as sojourners in this land? How are we able to offer up our anything? How are we able to do that? Well, God points to Sarah. What an interesting phrase that she used. By faith, Sarah received strength. By faith, Sarah received strength. Even though she was beyond the age of childbearing, even though she struggled to understand the how this was going to take place, we know the why in this passage because of the one that she judged as faithful. Now, I said we would go back there, but let's go back to Genesis 18 now. We read from that passage about verses, 15 through, we read kind of at the beginning, 9 through 12. I want you to pick up right where we left off in that passage. Do you remember verse 12? Sarah laughed within herself, saying, I've grown old and have pleasure my Lord being old also. Let's finish that context. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Now here's a question. Verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. What an interesting place for this. Sarah overhears, you're going to be the one that's going to bear a son. And she giggles at the thought. She doesn't understand the how that's possible. Well, everyone, Abraham and Sarah included, were told the how. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Now, we sit here right now, and if I went around the room and were to ask every single one of you, is anything too hard for the Lord? Everyone would give the same answer this morning. Everybody would say. Everybody would say the same thing. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. And I think as Abraham was receiving this question from God, that was his answer. But you see, coming to the reality of that answer then makes a big difference. There isn't anything too hard for the Lord. How am I able to grow in my faith? How am I able to offer up my anything? How am I able to do any of those things? Because I trust the one for whom nothing is too hard. And so when we go back to Hebrews chapter 11, and we're reading about the faith of Sarah, she was able to do that because she judged him faithful who had promised. I don't understand the how. It seems ridiculous. But nothing is too hard for God. One final passage. We think about our faith now. There's a reality that our faith requires us to look to God for help in the life that we live and trust that he is able to provide it, even here. That's where Abraham and Sarah were. They had to trust in the one who had promised. And their life then was affected. And that's how we are today. In Hebrews chapter 4, in verse 14 of that text, we'll close with this idea. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help. When? In times of need. You see, then we too can lean on and judge the one who has promised as being able to handle anything. He is the one that can offer help in times of need. And so when we think about, as we close, this idea of faith and how foundational it is, it comes down to trust and leaning on God for everything. In those times when we don't know exactly where we're going or what's going to happen. In those times that we struggle to understand the how or the why or the where. But we can trust God. That's what we can do. Think about all the times in your life individually where that would have played an important role. Think about your life within your family and the times that would have played a role. There have been so many times as a husband, as a father, all of my kids, I have two older boys who are, one's married, one's almost out of college. My youngest, my baby, who Scott made mention of, is here. But she's a senior in high school, and she's about to go to college. And I think back over the years of all the times that I have been burdened by the how, or burdened by the why, and the moments that I wasted thinking and worrying about those things, instead of trusting God, whom nothing is too hard, and lean fully upon faith. That's the lesson of Abraham and Sarah. They did it individually, for sure, but they also did it together. And it is a powerful, powerful lesson for each and every one of us. Well, we're going to sing a song of invitation. It gives us an opportunity to be thinking about where we are with God and our relationship with Him. We read the passage there, that heavy, heavy passage that talked about counting the cost before entering into a relationship with Jesus. Is it worth it? Absolutely. Because of all of the good things that he has promised to help us here, but also in what he has promised in the life that is to come. But yet it is a serious decision to be made, and a considerate decision to be made. And maybe you're there this morning. Maybe you've walked away from your relationship with Christ and you realize how foolish that was. You make a commitment today to come back to him. Build your faith back to where it needs to be. If we can help in any way, let us know as we